Hello, I am the High Apostate, Phineas 12 Gauge, and this is the Apostate's Playground, the podcast where I disassociate slightly so that I can cope with going through the terribly written, terribly immoral, and sometimes just terrifying books of ideas of, and weird shit that happens in the orbit of, the people who want to theocratize your life. Real quick before I get into this, recently the Catholic Church made it against Catholic law for priests to abuse adults. And that sounds great, but I want to remind you that this is a meaningless bullshit gesture that is exclusively for PR. The Catholic Church is now and has been and probably always will be until its dying breath an evil cesspit of abuse, and while admittedly, I am feeling a little more anti-Catholic since I started listening to The Turning, The Sisters Who Left, this is a feeling that I had before then and will likely always be there. To be against Catholic law doesn't actually mean anything. Their criminal jurisdiction, if there is one, would likely be, and should definitely be, limited to their 1/2 square kilometer theocracy. It's basically meaningless. And this is the first revision in 40 years. 40 years of priests abusing kids and being shuffled around and having it covered. So what does the church do? Make it illegal for priests to abuse adults in a square half mile of a kilometer on the planet if there actually is any criminal penalties available for the church to dish out. And that's about 1/5 of a square mile, or in practice, 0 of any miles in any of the dimensions. More than likely what will happen is if the church catches too much shit, they will hold a rapist or two accountable by excommunicating them and letting the authorities deal with it, and the rest of the church will just continue on the way they fucking have been. So, I just wanted to remind you that if someone tells you, well, the church is doing doobie-doop, you know that has about as much value as actually saying doobie-doop at the problem, and they should be the fuck ashamed. Because at most, somebody will get excommunicated. On to the show. In Genesis 27, Rebekah says that she doesn't want Jacob to take wives from the land because they might be like the daughters of Heth that Esau married, and then she called them bitches. Oh, and Jacob fucked Esau out of his blessing, and Esau was blessed too, even though he lost his blessing, and then promised to, and was blessed to, murder to pixie sticks Jacob after Isaac dies. Which is the other thing that happened, and informs why we're picking up with Isaac telling Jacob to bounce the fuck on out of here. But rather because we're continuing the copy-paste adventures of Isaac and Abraham. Jacob shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, so he needs to go to Bethuel's house and find a wife from the daughters of Laban. And if that sounds like cousin fucking, it makes that clear. He specifically calls Laban your mother's brother. Now, again, while societally gross and definitely worth noting, it's not super detrimental to the viability of the children they, spoiler alert, have. It's also at the root of some anti-Semitic ideas regarding Jacob Creutzfeldt's disease, I think is the name, Tay-Sachs, things like that are going to be their own episode because the history of the anti-Semitism around the Jewish diseases is too much of a topic to handle here. And Jacob gets another blessing, and you can probably guess here, may you have a lot of babies and get some land. So Jacob did what he was told to, and it was fine. But wait! Esau witnessed it all, and so he went and got another wife, Mahalath, daughter of Ishmael. A lot of cousin fucking. I feel like they're wanting to just really hammer home the fact that there definitely was enough inbreeding to cause an issue if these stories are true. And that's why biblical literalism leads to anti-Semitism. But more on that on the episode, I promised, when it gets made. So the reason that he went and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife is because Isaac also didn't like his current daughters-in-law, as evidenced by the immense amount of shit they talked about him and his wives. Then he spent some more time with Jacob T. Grifter, and now I'm going to tell you about a dream Jacob had. He went toward Haran and used a rock as a pillow and went to sleep. The dream he had was that there was a ladder on the earth. It reached up into the heavens, and there were angels going up and down the ladder, which seems dangerous. If we're being honest, you'd think God could afford multiple ladders, or would have invented OSHA. So God, instead of announcing that he's invented OSHA, has announced that he is the God of Abraham and Isaac, and where Jacob is sleeping will be the land of him and his descendants, and blah, 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 nothing new. Then he woke up and decided God knew about that place and power there, which would seem to indicate that God hadn't evolved into his omnipresent and or omnipotent state yet. So, declaring it the house of God and gate of heaven, he goes back to sleep. Then he consecrated the rock that he was sleeping on with oil and called it Bethel, but it had been Luz previously. Then Jacob declared that he will have breakfast and get dressed, and the rock is God's health, and he will give God 1/10 of everything God gives him for tithing. We ran into tithing again, I guess. More on that in a minute. First, there's going to be a footnote and a sidebar, and then an additional sidebar. The footnote is John Wesley saying the ladder is how God and earth interact, and he gives vague allusions that it's Jesus. The ladder is Jesus. And we're directed to Colossians 1:20, where it makes it clear the ladder is Jesus. It reads, quote, "And by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross." That has major God did things to himself, by himself, for himself energy. And after that, we are going to go to the Colossians 1:20 sidebar, because it's going to be a while before the show arrives there naturally, especially with all of the tangents that I tend to go on. So we will have grown and learned as people by the time we get there again, and the answers and the thoughts might be different. Who knows? So let's do it now. That way we can compare and contrast. But first, the points for open air preaching sidebar that is actually on this page. The points for open air preaching sidebar here is called the math of open air preaching. Spoiler alert, there's not actually a lot of math here. The first paragraph says that open air preaching is like when you're sharing the gospel with someone who is engaged and exciting times 30. And that's all the math. That's the math of open air preaching. And watching some of Ray's videos, 30 might be pushing it for crowd size for him, but okay, I won't push back on that too much. It also lets you know there's nothing like the feeling when there's a crowd and a good heckler. I'm not sure Ray has ever met a good heckler. I'm not even convinced that the street preachers' hecklers aren't just members of their congregation volunteering. But picture this. You're a young evangelical and you're just about to start open air preaching. We get some tips about how to help those nerves, how to get ready. You practice at home. Recite the gospel until it's first nature. Replace all of your innate knowledge with a learned recitation of the gospel. Breathing? You don't need to breathe. Breathe in scripture. Breathe out truth. Heart pumping blood? Get it flowing with the word of the Lord. Do you have concerns about things that it's completely understandable and totally reasonable to have concerns about because they're things that if more people did and if more people thought about them or put forth the little bit of effort to learn about them, progress and humanity could carry forward into a bright new world? Fuck that. You have Jesus. Maybe call over some friends, run a little improv, you standing on your coffee table in your button up and your Dockers and your cop shades, preaching and spreading the gospel word of which is the essence of the whole Bible distilled through 4 books and into you through the interpretation of a bunch of other books that not infrequently contradict the 4 books that are the gospels, and also not infrequently contradict themselves. Now, if you have any self-awareness left after this, you're advised to take a Bible with you as a backup plan. And I have a couple of questions about the fact you apparently weren't taking one before, but alas, I'm given no answers. And you should prepare to simply ask people to let you read part of it. Then you open it up, you read John chapter 3, verse 16, and, you thank them politely for listening after that. In case you were worried about looking stupid, just read the most famous Bible verse directly out of the book. You know, that one that everybody knows. This is why I carry around a pocket Austin. It's just a piece of paper with "I just whooped your ass" written on it. And if you don't get that reference, you should go watch King of the Ring 1996. I can't do everything for you. I'm already reading this stupid book. Although, warning, if you do go watch it, there is a part where Stone Cold takes a jab at the fact that Jake Roberts had some substance abuse issues. But, I mean, other than that, it's a solid promo that he cut. Back onto the sidebar, though, because it does give some good advice. It actually gives some advice that I wish more people would take, and not just evangelicals, but kind of just everybody in the world except me, because I'm correct in all things. It says that if you don't know the answer to a question, just say you don't know. Just say, I don't have an answer, but I'm happy to find one for you. And that's a perfectly reasonable answer. That's what you should say when you don't know things. And if you follow the example of the evangelists that sell training in being obnoxious in a plaza, you will literally never do this. You know when you get that feeling where you're crapping on evangelicals and you're in a room by yourself and it's late at night and you feel like there's definitely something pissed off watching behind you? If I go missing suddenly, we're all wrong and God is pissed. On to the next sidebar. That one is in Colossians 1:20, but that's because the footnote that references the verse where we got told about Jacob's ladder contains a quote that references it. The quote is by John Wesley, and I touched on that and that verse just a bit ago. It's basically Paul saying that you go to heaven through Jesus by climbing Jacob's ladder. The sidebar in question here is the questions and comments variety, and it is about making your peace with God and how people who say that they have no concept of or living relationship with God and have disobeyed him. And so you have to walk them through the 10 Commandments to show them that they're actually terrible people, to get them to quit being self-righteous. I think this might be a good time to touch on God concepts and God models. And to do that, I'm going to pull out a different book that has an essay on this topic. The essay in question is God and the World by Sally McFaig, and she outlines 5 different types of God model and then introduces a 6th one that is a hybrid of 2 of the others in order to make a case that with this God model, we're more likely to be nice to each other and care about existential threats like climate change. She was pretty big on climate change. There's a link to a talk she gave at Yale Divinity School a couple years before she died, which was really just a few years before we exist now, in the show notes if you're curious. It's pretty dry, but I watched it, and it's a less toxic kind of Christianity, which is nice, especially given the kind of stuff that atheists usually see from Christianity. And I'm not going to tell you what to watch. So, the 5 traditional models of God that she goes over are the deistic model, the dialogic model, the monarchical model, the agential model, and the organic model. There are other models, definitely, I'm sure. I've been reading up on naturalistic pantheism recently, and that is kind of an organic model of God, but it's the kind that is the sexed up atheism that Dawkins was talking about. And it's getting my theists about metaphysics brain all riled up. Here, I'm going to focus on the 5 that McFaig does because they're the ones I'm most familiar with, and like she points out, these seem to be the most common Christian God models. So the deistic model is the clockmaker God. It just kind of winds everything up, lets it go. And it's what we're talking about when we talk about the God of Spinoza that Einstein was also talking about. It's an intelligence, and it set everything up, but it's just going. We're an ant farm made by God for a science fair, and we've been in that area where your dad is pretending your garage has an upstairs. Really, he just laid down some particle board or like some underflooring, and you're really worried you'll step through it because that's not the fuck safe. That's not finished, Dad. And we've been up there becoming super ants for the last few thousand years, and God doesn't really bother with us. And she doesn't like this because she says it encourages people to be idolatrous about science and encourages Christians to have a God of the gaps view of God, which she thinks is a no-no. So, point against her points. The dialogic model is that God is a guy that we talk to. This is the kind of God that's very common in Protestantism, and I don't think that it's fair to characterize it that way, but I'll come back to that. The third is the monarchical model. In this model, God is an all-powerful ruler who is just after your loyalty. He just wants you to believe and serve him, and if you don't, then you get punished. This has a lot of relevance for discussing evangelical Christianity, and we will be coming back. The fourth model that she talks about is the agential model. In the agential model, God is like a special agent working behind the scenes with a plan that unfolds gradually. You've heard that the arc of history is long and bend towards justice, but in the agential model of God, the arc of history is long and it bends towards God's will, which, if we get history right, we'll be able to see. And this one almost works for McFaig, but she sees the presence of God less as an intelligence directing everything, the immanent presence of God, and she sees that immanence more as a spirit. That's what is meant when the Bible talks about the breath of life. She was big on metaphor, and a lot of her work on Christianity was based on it. Lastly, the fifth of the OG GOD models is the organic model. And the organic model is pantheism. Everything is God's body. You, me, earth, universe, the whole deal is God's body, and that's where we live. What McFaig would like us to adopt is what she calls the agential organic model of God. In this model, God is agential in that he is immanent-ish. He's not so much with us here as he is enveloping us in his divine breathiness that permeates the universe like the Force. And honestly, that would have been a much better explanation than blood bugs. And if you don't get that reference, watch The Phantom Menace, although I won't believe that you haven't or that you didn't like it. It's the 42nd highest grossing movie of all time. A bunch of you liked it. Or you're a weird kind of sadist, in which case, you know what? You fucking liked it. God as force is offset by the fact that God as agent bends the arc of history. It's sort of like owning a koi pond. You transcend the koi pond. You are outside of it. Your influence is inside of it. You are, however, fully within your power to walk into the pond at any time, and you would still transcend it. You would have an immediate impact on it. Your legs would be wet, but you would not be of the pond. You would be something from outside the pond that is able to go into the pond. And the history of the fish in the pond would bend towards your will, whether that's feeding them or filling the pond gradually with bourbon and seeing what happens. They die, or whatever it is that your will is. That's where the pond is going. That is where the long arc of history of the koi pond bends. And you're doing that as somebody that is outside of the pond, except that in her metaphor, you're also the water. So it does get a little murky water. But it's this kind of, we are all filled with God's breath and God is a thing outside of us breathing on us kind of God that she wants us to see. Breath being a metaphor for spirit. This is hard to do in 5 minutes. But when we look at these 6 God models, when we apply it to Ray's statement that if we've made our peace with the big guy upstairs, that you don't have a concept of God, that you don't have a model of God, it becomes pretty clear that you don't have a God model means that you don't have Ray's God model. You don't have the correct God concept. It's well within the Christian's wheelhouse to say that if you don't have their concept of God, you don't have one. So I'll just take that as the leap he made to ask the question, which of these makes the most sense as the kind of God that is romanticized into a loving father figure by the kind of people who buy this book for a purpose that isn't trying to tear it to philosophical shreds for listeners. And in the model we're expected to accept, God is a ruling presence that demands we fear them, love them, and accept them as our Father, King, legislator, and spiritual guide in a kind of transcendent feudalist theocracy, all while maintaining a constant dialogue, a constant conversation. It takes on the meaning of, much like Cuzco, some kind of court that's held where you are able to present your griefs to the emperor as long as you don't throw off his groove. Watch The Emperor's New Groove. I'm not holding your hand through this. It's easily the third best movie David Spade will ever be in. You should have seen it by now. So it's clear that this part is a transcendent monarchical model that we are in conversation with. So it's a monarchical dialogic model. It's a monologic model. Except that's not a term in philosophy. I just said it and I don't really like it because it seems confusing. It seems like it should already be a thing. But when we take that monarchical dialogic model and we apply Jesus to the same ideas, it's clear that Jesus is also dialogic, more dialogic perhaps than God, since he's the part that gets us through to heaven. It's kind of like if we breathed out the water into the koi pond that we transcended, but we controlled, and so they worshipped us. And so we had our kid go out and bring us the good fish, the ones that were well behaved. They didn't cause any problems, so we just plucked them up out of the water, and the kid brought us the fish, and the fish gets to live with us in the living room. It's not a accident that in that metaphor the fish clearly dies. I don't think that heaven sounds like a particularly healthy environment for a person or a fish. And that's a lot of words there to get to a point, but it's a point that Ray doesn't understand. There's a bunch of God models just in Christianity, just in Christian philosophy. He thinks that if you've made peace with the man upstairs, then you've totally abandoned the notion of having a concept of God. But from one essay, there's 6 God models that have been pulled and laid out, and it seems like Ray is touching on at least 2 of them. The idea that saying that if you can make peace with God, it's just not cohesive to a God model is wrong. It just isn't cohesive to his God model, which is a crazed monarch who demands your fear and your love and your loyalty and just wants to hurt you. But he doesn't, because his kid, who he killed because of how awful you are, keeps vouching for you. The reason that you can't make peace with Ray's God isn't because he has the right one. It's not because you don't have one if you're a Christian who's listening to this for some reason. And it's not because you haven't heard the 10 Commandments, and that's applicable to everybody. It's because Ray's God doesn't want to make peace with you. Ray's God fucking hates you. So yeah, if you make peace with Ray's God, you're probably not doing a very good job of being a moral person, because a moral person doesn't have that kind of tyrant, and the crosshairs is something to aspire to have a relationship with. My kids can make peace with me. My friends can make peace with me. My family can make peace with me. They can all go to bed resting easy, knowing, hey, you know what? Even though I have messed up, Phineas has my back, except they would use my real name. Even some people that I despise can make peace with me. There are people that I would never speak to again, that if I saw them broken down on the side of the road in the rain, I'd help them change a tire, because that's just the nice person thing to do. But you can't do that with Ray's God, because Ray's God is a bad person. Which brings us to buying his love. In this chapter and earlier chapters, in this chapter and an earlier chapter where Abraham wrestles Melchizedek, in my head, old man diaper fight mud wrestling contest are the first mentions of what could be tithing in the Bible. They were given apparently as a holy sacrament, although I can't find any reason why that would have started. It is possible that it's part of a tradition that included oral instructions about this, and later there are laws about giving 10% of what to wear. And it does make sense that since I'm not even convinced that Genesis was written before Leviticus, It seems like this all was handed down from oral traditions that were previously established that then fed into a assumed foreknowledge when they wrote the book that isn't what it was starting. It's confusing and dumb. And interestingly, there also seems to be an English unit of measurement that was used for tax assessment called a tithing. It was 10 hides, and I'm going to quote from the etymology section of Wikipedia because I didn't look too terribly much farther than that except to make sure that Wikipedia was more or less right. Quote, "The noun tithing is not to be confused with the verb tithing nor act of tithing, though they partly share the same origin. The noun breaks down as 10 and thing, which is to say a thing, an assembly of the households who live in an area that comprises 10 hides. Sound changes in the prehistory of English are responsible for the first part of the word looking so different from the word 10. In the West Germanic dialects, which became Old English, N had a tendency to elide with positioned immediately before a th. And elide is just a slurring or an omitting of a sound, kind of like when I talk, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and if you're born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, you have a little bit of a slur. So I'm sure you have noticed that I don't tend to say getting, going, shopping, looking, reading. I say shopping, going, looking, reading. And that's because I'm eliding over the G. And I'm not saying for sure that the English noun of tithing from 10th century tax law influenced the translation of a book from the 17th century led by a king, but I'm not saying that. There are two other things that I thought are interesting. One is that the spiritualist seed faith crooks the movement of spiritual inner awareness, which is a future episode topic, and a group I might join, maybe, possible Patreon goal. I join stupid cults. In this case, one that gave the unsourced claim, in biblical times, people who tithed often received 100-fold back more than what they had given. When they received their 100-fold, they then gave 10% of that. And that is a sentence I would like to slap. In biblical times, you could just give 10% of what you had to and get back 100-fold of what you had given. So let's see, I have 100 shekels, and I give 10 shekels, and then I get back 10 times 100 shekels, which is 1,000 shekels. So I give 100 shekels, and then I get back 10,000 shekels, and pretty soon hell, not even the primitive economy that would have been established at the time, but the actual economy that is established now would collapse because that's not the way to run a fucking economy. But if you were wondering if they had a plant your seed button, you're goddamn right. The second note is that there is a tithing practice in modern day Judaism. It's Maser Kesefim, which my Jewish learning translates as wealth tax. But they mention that it has kind of a general vibe of a voluntary contribution because a rabbi gotta eat. So it may not have been the give God money or go to a pit of eternal damnation like you get in Christian churches, which have dropped the general vibe of, hey, a pastor gotta eat. Probably sometime around, if I had to guess, the Crusades. And if you would like to make a voluntary contribution to help a podcaster eat and or avoid a pit of eternal damnation, head over to patreon.com/apostatesplayground and make a recurring donation of as little as $1. The little apostate ossels will thank you. And I will, regardless. Thank you for listening. I have been the High Apostate Phineas 12 Gauge. This has been the Apostates Playground. The email is poweredbyapostasy@gmail.com. The Twitter is the letter X, Essential Panda, or @apostasypowered for the feed. That's just episodes. And remember, it doesn't relate to this episode, but it's still good advice now that I look at it at the end of me recording. Don't say she's your sister, mister.